I'm not great with numbers, never been a big math person, but I do like learning about important dates and statistics throughout history. They help me to more clearly ground and envision events of the past. Which is why, when I knew I wanted to do an episode about women's football, aka soccer, I had a hiccup trying to find a specific number, the record for biggest crowd throughout its history. You'd think there'd be a quick answer, just one number. But when I started digging, it soon became more complicated than that. A quick web search and a few games are frequently cited. If we're talking club games, there's the May 2018 final between Mexican clubs Tigres and Rayadas, drawing 51,200 people into the stadium. However, this is dated, as an article from the following year lists the May 2019 matchup of Spanish clubs Barcelona and Atletico Madrid as breaking the record with a crowd of 60,739. The strange thing is, this piece, published by BBC, does not mention this new record in relation to the Mexican final from the previous year, but in fact, a match played on Boxing Day of 1920. A showdown between the Dick Kerr's ladies and St. Helens ladies supposedly took place in front of 53,000 fans, a record the article suggests had remained for nearly a century. An odd discrepancy, but still, it was clear the 2019 match had the record for women's club competition. Looking into the international matches, where players represent their home countries, and in fact a singular match is often cited. The legendary 1999 World Cup final, featuring Brenny Chastain's tournament-winning penalty kick and her iconic shirt off, knees to the ground, fists in the air celebration. That was played in a packed Rose Bowl crowd of 90,185. The Associated Press, one of the more renowned news agencies in the world, cites this as the record attendance for any women's soccer match ever. And it makes sense. This is the last time the U.S., arguably the most dominant country in women's soccer history, played a World Cup final on home soil. When I came across this statistic in the AP article, I thought I had found the number I was looking for, and that was that. As I continued to do research for this episode, I started looking into information about women's soccer in Mexico specifically, not because they're a known powerhouse of the sport, but more out of personal curiosity. My father's from Mexico, and despite personally being born and raised in the United States, I've always sided with his home country in all things soccer related, even when the neighboring nations clashed. That is, when the men played. I started to think, and if I was being honest, I couldn't even remember watching a United States-Mexico match. Sure, I'd seen numerous US games, but usually against other historically renowned international squads, such as Canada, Japan, Germany, or Sweden. I made the presumptuous guess that, unfortunately, based on my knowledge and experience in understanding certain socioeconomic and cultural circumstances, women in Mexico had never been given the same opportunities as the women from many other of the previously mentioned countries. And while yes, many Mexican women have not had the same opportunities as women from several other parts of the world, there is in fact a largely unheard of history of soccer in the country, a glorious, although short-lived, golden era of Mexican women's soccer that almost helped spark the rise of the sport internationally, over 20 years before women anywhere participated in a FIFA-sanctioned tournament. This will be a bit long, so I'm actually deciding to split this story into two parts. In the first episode, we'll look at the history of women's soccer in general and how the Mexican women almost became one of the first global forces of the sport. In part 2, we'll see how the United States women seemingly came out of nowhere, surpassing the Mexicans to not only become the most dominant team in North America, but of the world. And where the sport may be heading moving forward. So here we go. This is the story of the forgotten Women's World Cup and the tumultuous journey women's soccer has been through before and since. Part 1. Before delving into a history of the Women's World Cup, here's a brief summary of women's history with the sport as a whole. Soccer's origins as a whole are so lengthy, several aspects of its history are up for debate, but in general, it is largely thought to have originated in China and spread into the Roman Empire before eventually reaching the British Isles, where it developed into the modernized version we see today. While there are accounts of both men and women playing the sport in parts of Europe in the late 18th century, it wasn't until the early 1800s that men began organizing clubs and arranging leagues largely built of neighboring towns. Women's leagues would take a bit longer to develop. In fact, some of the first accounts of women playing soccer in the United Kingdom are not in a league designed for leisurely entertainment, but rather an odd marriage ritual involving single and married women performing in front of a crowd of men. I'm a little unclear on the specifics, but in general, it seemed to be the Place and Time's hit matchmaking game. Eventually, however, following the founding of the English Football Association in 1863, women's teams began organizing in similar fashion as the men had decades prior. The first recorded international women's match took place in 1881 between Scotland and England. A reporter from the Glasgow Herald described the Scottish squad as looking smart in blue jerseys, white knickerbockers, red belts, and high-heeled boots. The match would end in a 3-0 victory for Scotland, with one Lily St. Clair arguably scoring the opening goal in modern women's soccer. The very next scheduled match began in Glasgow, but was shut down abruptly when, in the midst of play, hundreds of men stormed the field in protest, angered by women performing acts entirely against their oh-so-noble Victorian society morals. The women were forced to rush off the field, narrowly escaping by bus, which, at the time, simply meant an oversized horse-drawn carriage, as spectators continued to clash and brawl with police. A foreshadowing, if ever, to the nearly century-and-a-half battle for greater gender equality in the world of soccer. Despite the clear message sent by a great number of men at the time, the end of the 19th century saw women's soccer continue to grow in the British Isles. In 1894, as more and more women gathered to play, a great number of British medical professionals called for girls and women to be banned from soccer altogether. Unfazed, the very next year, a collection of women established the British Ladies Football Club. Splitting the club into a North and South squad, they played their opening match in front of approximately 10,000 fans. While they received proper playing boots and no longer had to wear the corsets worn by the women of the inaugural international match back in 1881, they were still required to wear sports bonnets over their heads, with the game being stopped if any player's head garment became dislodged. While the match was played in front of a large crowd, a great number were not there in support, but instead as antagonizers and hecklers, entirely opposed to women playing what they saw as a gentleman's game. While numerous of the British ladies' matches saw a great number of spectators, a lack of funding, as well as a loss in player personnel, saw the league dissolve by early 1897. At the time, the sport of soccer was beginning to spread globally. Japan's first men's soccer game is thought to have been played in 1888, and early accounts of men's soccer games in Nigeria began around 1904. While at this time there are no records of organized women's leagues in the majority of the world, we can at least assume young children, regardless of gender, at least kicked a ball around from time to time. As I think is the case with various cases of prejudice and hate throughout history, certain acts and practices are accepted, until a point. My guess is few people were up in arms if very young children, boys and girls, were running around chasing a ball. However, I imagine few girls anywhere were able to continue to play the sport into their teenage years without some form of backlash. While all this is inferred, what is known is that very little, as far as organized systemic progress, occurred in the world of women's soccer throughout the early 20th century. The next noticeable leap in the advancement of the sport occurs at a time that often leads to a great deal of change on a number of fronts. War. World War I uncorked rising international tensions, spilling violence into numerous continents as opposing political structures, assassinations, and petty beefs between powerful global leaders resulted in the deaths of millions of soldiers and civilians. As nearly 10 million British soldiers mobilized for the conflict, women were called upon to take over work that had predominantly been done by men in the past. While I should note, thousands of women were called upon to serve in the war, largely as nurses and in other medical positions, but also as soldiers on the front line, the point is, the United Kingdom saw a great deal of men leave in an instant, and women were there to fill a void. One of my favorite movies growing up was a picture titled A League of Their Own, starring Gina Davis, Madonna, and a hilariously unpleasant Tom Hanks. It tells the story of a women's baseball team and their time in the American Girls Baseball League, formed in the early 40s by Major League Baseball executives keen on keeping the sport in the public eye, even as the nation saw roughly 16 million of its healthiest men get shipped off to war. While the origins of the Girls Baseball League contrast to the events occurring in Britain during World War I, the absence of healthy male bodies created an opportunity for the women of the time. What in early World War I seems to have started as women getting together after work and on their days off to play soccer and pass the time, quickly led into organized leagues and clubs. While the war ended in November of 1918, games played by professional women's teams continued into the next decade. The record that the BBC article mentioned, the 53,000 fans watching the Dick Kerr ladies and the St. Helens ladies, that game is from this time and place. However, as Western Europe entered a time of at least some stability, attention turned to internal atrocities, which in England apparently meant the continuation of organized women's soccer. In late 1921, the Football Association banned women from playing altogether, deeming it unsuitable and not to be encouraged under any circumstances. It's pretty remarkable to think that the sport was being played in front of crowds the size of a sold-out Yankee Stadium one year, and then banned altogether the next. The following decades see a series of attempts to spark organized women's soccer across the world to varying degrees of success. As I mentioned, soccer had spread out of the British Isles by the turn of the 20th century and experienced a huge wave of growth following the First World War. By the end of the 20s, it had become the most popular sport on the planet, with the inaugural Men's World Cup taking place in 1930. With the sport being played on the streets and fields of just about every country on Earth, it only made sense that the widespread exposure soon led to women seeking opportunities to form professional leagues of their own. As Brazil fell in love with the sport, now considered home to arguably the best soccer culture on Earth, many felt only half of the country should be allowed to play, banning women from the sport in 1941, a policy that would last until 1979. At the same time, the women in countries affected by World War II once again actually had some opportunity to play. However, the even more widespread devastation the Second World War caused resulted in much less opportunity for league organization in Europe. Further, after the war, once European society shifted back into a peacetime mindset, the English Football Association continued its ban on professional women's soccer, a practice several European nations had too adopted by this point. Meanwhile, across the world, certain locations were experiencing, while not quite revolutions in women's soccer, waves of acceptance and growth were occurring. In 1950, the Craig Club Girls Soccer League became the first women's soccer organization in the United States. In the early 60s, cities in Nigeria began hosting organized women's games, creating early roots for what has become by far the most successful African nation in the sport. In Latin America, despite certain countries also banning women from play, Argentina and Costa Rica became early strongholds of the region. In 1963, wanting to spread the sport to neighboring countries, the Costa Ricans formed a squad and went on tour, encouraging countries to form their own to play against. This resulted in a 6-month tour throughout Mexico, who'd been able to quickly put together a team of their own. The tour was absolutely a success in my view because, while no properly funded leagues came of this, soon clubs were formed by women simply passionate to play the sport. The Costa Ricans had provided an exposure that inspired many of their neighbors to the north, a feat that would soon lead to the largest event in women's soccer to date. It's hard to say just how much the tour played a part in the growth of the sport, but what's undeniable is, across Mexico, there were many women and girls interested in seeing it advance. Girls like Alicia Vargas. Born in 1954, she would have only been 9 at the time the Costa Ricans began traveling through Mexico. While I couldn't find whether she was ever able to see any of these matches that were a part of the tour, what is known about her childhood is that it was filled with endless hours of soccer in the streets of Guadalajara, playing with the older boys, as the tales of so many women in sports, especially from the past, tend to begin. Growing up poor and small, she looked up to soccer folk heroes of the time, like Brazilian winger Garrincha, a 5'6" player born with his right leg 6 centimeters shorter than his left, and his left leg turned outwards, with the right going inwards. Labeled a cripple at a young age and forced to work in factories as a child, his time playing soccer provided him with some of his most freedom he experienced in his early years. It wouldn't be until his late teen years he signed for a professional team, to go on to have one of the best careers in soccer history, with Brazil never once losing a game when he and Pelé played in the same match. A man of the people, he was a perfect hero for a kid with big dreams to put on a pedestal as an example of improbable achievement. Of course, for Vargas, the odd of being hailed as an internationally renowned champion felt even less likely and was less encouraged. Vargas talks about her mother pulling her away from street games by the ear in disapproval of her participation. Still, she continued to hone her skills, spending time to learn not one position, but all of them, even working on her goalkeeping reflexes as she made it her goal to master every aspect of the sport. Her effort would pay off at the age of just 14, when she saw tryouts for a newly founded women's soccer team, Club Guadalajara. She excelled, despite playing, as she says, without socks and with borrowed sneakers, and earned a spot on her hometown squad. At the time, throughout the 60s, a great number of civil rights were being discussed in numerous countries across the globe. Among these were a great number of women's rights, in what many referred to as second wave feminism, an all-encompassing term regarding this period of advancement, including job opportunity, contraceptive and abortion rights, and an overall greater political voice. It was at this time that many bans on women's inclusion were lifted, which in certain nations began to include sports. While several national soccer federations refused to recognize women's leagues as professional, many places could no longer ban the organized form of the sport. So, while still lacking the support of various soccer federations, by 1970 there was enough interest in seeing the best players of each nation compete in a World Cup style that was increasingly becoming popular on the men's side. Unfortunately, domestic soccer federations were and continue to be associated with the International Federation of Association Football, or FIFA, who have been the organizers of each men's World Cup to date. At the time, it seemed the wealthiest and most powerful organization in soccer history simply had no interest in funding or putting together a women's tournament. So, without support or a blueprint, the newly formed Federation of Independent European Football, or FIEFF, decided to take charge and swiftly organized a tournament to be held in Italy in the summer of 1970. Sponsored by the Italian alcoholic beverage producer Martini and Rossi, the company helped fund the travel and uniforms of the nations to be involved. I had a hard time finding out exactly how invitations were sent to nations, and which ones were asked to partake initially, but ultimately, word got to Mexico, and a coaching and scouting team were quickly put together to form the first ever women's Mexican national squad, among them none other than 16-year-old Vargas, who had yet again rose to the occasion, becoming one of the youngest players on the roster. 8 teams were scheduled to partake, but Czechoslovakia was forced to withdraw due to what reports say were visa issues largely caused by Cold War tensions. Although, interestingly enough, the men had just performed in the Men's World Cup in Mexico a month prior, so take that as you will. Besides a double elimination process for West Germany, the rest of the bracket played out like a normal quarterfinal setup. Mexico faced off against Austria and, well, eviscerated them. The final score read 9-0, with Vargas tallying a game-high 4 goals to send the Mexicans to the semifinals. Instantly hailed as the revelation of the tournament, it must have been quite a surprise for the Europeans. Sure, several male Latin American teams had won and shown skills in previous World Cups, but as the only non-European, non-white majority team, just based on stereotypes and a lack of exposure, their ability to dominate a European team likely came as a shock to many. Sadly, the wild start of the tournament would come to a quick halt for the Mexicans, losing their semifinal match against Italy 2-1. Denmark would go on to win the first ever Women's World Cup, while Mexico would defeat West Germany in the third place match. And I guess I should be clear, This tournament was not technically licensed with the title Women's World Cup. The World Cup title was very specific to FIFA and the tournament they had been running with the men up until this time, but because this is a tournament in which I would argue the best women's players got to play against each other, I'm going to call it the World Cup. The Mexican women had hoped for a better outcome, but the chance to put their talents on display for the world was already an accomplishment in and of itself. After all, upon leaving for Italy, they had received little domestic coverage. However, following their 9-0 win, the largest margin of victory in the tournament, the press ran wild in their home country. Upon landing home, they were greeted with dozens of mariachi bands, thousands of fans. One player said it was as if Michael Jackson had just arrived in town. For many, the widespread positive attention was truly unexpected. Of course, not all saw their performance in the same light. As the women returned to performing in their home country, articles were published with titles like, "Female soccer does not exist." Still, the women returned to playing in the underfunded, underorganized system that they had been operating in over the last couple of years, attracting far larger crowds following their performance in Italy. However, not all were in the stands as a result of earnest support. As Vargas says, many showed up simply due to a morbid curiosity, wanting to check out the women's legs in short shorts, to see if they could even physically chest the ball. But, whatever the reason, people were watching. So, in a few months' time, given the success of the previous cup, and once again with the support of Martini and Rossi, the IFEFF began organizing the 1971 Women's World Cup. I struggled to find direct information on how a host nation was selected, but ultimately that privilege was beset upon Mexico, giving their national team an automatic place as one of the 6 participating nations of the upcoming tournament. I can't say for sure what Mexican officials did or said to earn hosting rights, but it's likely that they didn't have to try hard. You see, Mexico had just hosted the Men's World Cup, the same year the Mexican women had earned 3rd place in Italy. And 2 years before that, they had hosted the 1968 Summer Olympics. Both produced events that I would argue still hold the spot as some of the best ever in their respective competitions. These Olympics were the first to be hosted in Latin America, the first to exclusively use electronic timekeeping equipment, and within the competition themselves, produced more broken world and Olympic records than any prior ceremony. The 1970 World Cup is too held in high regards, largely thought to be one of, if not the greatest World Cup of all time, featuring the Pelé and Carlos Alberto-led Brazilian team, which is too considered one of the best international teams of all time. Featuring a still unbroken record for highest World Cup goals per game ratio, even the heat and elevation could not prevent absolutely brilliant soccer being played the whole way through. Further, this was the first time the tournament had ever been broadcast live in color, introducing a whole new group of fans to the sport. While every country and culture can claim to be the most passionate people, Mexicans offer tough competition and were able to create a most joyous atmosphere for both of these undeniably successful tournaments. Of course, though, that's what was put on display for the world to see. The lively fans, the musical performances, the amazing stadiums. Estadio Azteca, for example, built for the 1968 Olympics, is one of the most iconic sporting venues on Earth to this day. For both the Olympics and the World Cup, cities went through months of preparation to provide visitors the best, most carefree stay possible. It seemed the Mexican government was not keen on portraying any messages except, have fun and enjoy your stay. I've seen the 4-hour documentary, The Olympics in Mexico. And while it's fantastic for many reasons, and you do have powerful political moments like the iconic raising of the fist by American sprinters John Carlos and Tommy Smith on the podium during the Star-Spangled Banner, there is little in substance regarding the political turmoil that was occurring just outside the walls of these packed stadiums. A quick-ish backstory. By the mid-60s, when Mexico knew it would be hosting the 2 upcoming major tournaments, they were well over 3 decades into a single party essentially possessing all the nation's political power. Labeled by some, La Dictadura Perfecta, the perfect dictatorship, The party had gone through a couple makeovers, but at this point was going by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI for short. Like lots of successful dictatorships, under their watch, there was a period of economic growth and success in Mexico. But many citizens, largely farmers and labor union members, soon became disgruntled by the lack of social improvements. By 1968, organized demonstrations were taking place, with large numbers of high school and university students joining in on the cause. This would all come to head on the evening of October 2nd, 1968, just 14 days before the Olympics were set to start. Demonstrations had begun earlier that day at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in the Tlatelolco, apologies for the pronunciation, neighborhood of Mexico City. Led by a coalition of approximately 10,000 students, eventually local residents, including young children, joined the crowd, if not directly in protest, to simply watch at the perimeter of the plaza. Among the chants was the phrase, "No queremos Olimpiades, queremos revolución." We don't want Olympics, we want revolution. As the event continued, a growing military presence could be seen at the outskirts of the gathering, hunkering down on rooftops, balconies, and deeper into the surrounding neighborhoods. Despite this, the protest continued. Around 6 p.m., a number of flares could be seen flying over the crowd. In a few minutes' time, 5,000 members of the military had descended on the plaza, essentially blocking all forms of exit. What happened next was largely disputed for decades, and, without clear footage of the overall event, could not be proven one way or the other for some time. While the government claimed it was the students who fired the first shots, the aftermath resulted in the deaths of hundreds of demonstrators, and because the bullet fire had been so rampant, the onslaught also killed several of the bystanders in nearby neighborhoods. Eventually, following the 2000 inauguration of Vicente Fox, the first non-PRI president in 71 years, an in-depth investigation reported that a special unit called the Brigada Olímpica, or the Olympic Brigade, opened fire on the crowd, starting the violence. The Olympic Brigade had been directly formed as a response to civil unrest, and as an attempt to silence voices of discontent, operating under the guise of overall national security. In October 2003, it was finally reported that the U.S. had sent radios, weapons, and ammo to the Olympic Brigade prior to and during the unrest that year. The CIA station in Mexico City was also providing the brigade with near-daily reports about concerns of the student unrest leading up to October 2nd. The CIA in Latin America is a mammoth of a topic that I can't do justice in this episode, nor is Mexico's incredibly frustrating 20th century government system, but I feel this event is very crucial in providing background for the incredibly successful tournaments that followed in Mexico. While this massacre is one of the true stains of Mexican history, this is not the first or the last time sporting events have been hosted in a nation home to incredibly contentious political times. Nazi Germany twice hosted the Olympics, albeit before World War II, but long after they had begun placing citizens in concentration camps and directly persecuting their Jewish citizens with numerous laws including removal of access to health insurance, ability to work most jobs, and segregation from non-Jewish citizens. In the 21st century, the 2014 World Cup as well as the 2016 Rio Olympics were ridden with controversies. Both hosted in Brazil, the events were met with mass protests and objections, as thousands of homes in various favelas were cleared for stadium construction, while safety controversies too riddled the process, including the tragic collapse of an overpass created due to World Cup renovation, ultimately injuring several and killing 2. The announcement that Russia would be hosting the 2018 World Cup was met with immense backlash. Citing high levels of racism in Russian soccer, rampant discrimination of Russia's queer community, and overall corruption of human rights abuses, many felt the World Cup should be relocated. It wasn't. In 2022, the World Cup is expected to take place in Qatar, the first Middle Eastern nation to host the tournament. When it was announced, immediate concerns of corruption between its government and FIFA were raised, as the nation had little in soccer history and would cost much more to host than other locations. Further, hundreds of migrants were called in to provide construction labor, living in Qatar under what is called the kafala system, primarily used in nations belonging to the Gulf Cooperation Council. This requires any migrant who is a quote-unquote unskilled worker to have an in-country sponsor, usually their employer, who is responsible for their visa and legal status. Obviously, this system is ripe with opportunity to commit incredibly horrific abuses of human rights, with bosses essentially having total control of the actions of their workforce. Reports have come out that migrants arriving to provide work for the upcoming World Cup have been subjected to slavery conditions, not being provided even the most basic resources, with allegations of workers being beaten simply for requesting food. An analysis by The Guardian revealed that over 6,500 migrant workers had died in the time since the nation had been granted the World Cup bid. While not all were directly associated with World Cup preparations, a great portion of recent migrant labor has been dedicated to improving infrastructure, building stadiums, etc. While the Qatari government claims only 37 migrants have died directly in stadium construction and that overall migrant deaths are within the expected range, there seems to be a lack of transparency and vigor in reporting deaths accurately. In Qatar, 1.2 million migrants work in the nation, making up approximately 94% of the total workforce, so abuse of migrant workers and human rights are not exactly new. However, hosting the world's most popular sporting event put a spotlight on some of these reports. Just this past month, during the European qualifying round for the World Cup, several teams have worn shirts calling for human rights and justice. While not directly calling out or targeting Qatar, they seem to be sending a clear message. The Beijing Winter Olympics, set for 2022, is beginning to experience controversy, with some politicians and human rights activists calling for its cancellation, largely citing the Xinjiang internment camps, created in an attempt to contain and indoctrinate members of the Uyghur ethnic group, as well as other Muslim communities. The camps, funded by the Chinese Communist Party, have been called acts of genocide by some, and continue to receive widespread scrutiny. I know this is a bit of a tangent, but the point is, we are certainly not past or above allowing events to take place at a great cost of human life. Events that often even profit those who committed the atrocities. And let me be clear, I do not think there's a single nation on Earth who could host otherwise. I haven't been able to find one, at least. The 2026 World Cup is set to be the first tri-nationally hosted cup, with rights shared between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The United States government, throughout Democratic and Republican presidencies, have continued to commit human rights violations overseas, and all three countries have absolutely abhorrent human rights records regarding indigenous communities. This isn't personal opinion. It's simply fact, based on the United Nations human rights and war crimes definitions. So, while it is absolutely horrific that, following a government-sanctioned massacre, the 68 Olympics carried on without basically any ramifications, it's not exactly shocking. After all, as I mentioned, Mexico was an undeniably fantastic host nation. Think of the drum performance at the introduction of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, or the incredible music and dancing that kicked off Rio in 2016. You put on a good enough show, and it's easy for the attention to turn to the fun on display. I do it every World Cup. Of course, I don't want workers to suffer or die to make a tournament happen. It's horrific. But have I religiously watched every World Cup to memory? Absolutely. It seemed that the organizers of the 1971 Women's World Cup wanted to make their tournament a grander spectacle than the year prior, hoping to build on the previous tournament's foundation and grow. Of course, it wouldn't be a women's sporting event in the 70s without some seemingly well-intentioned but absolutely ridiculous sexism sprinkled into the affair. In a distinctly early 70s way of attempting to grow the brand and appeal to a woman audience, pink was incorporated into just about every aspect of the tournament. Workers, staff, even the team translators wore pink. This wasn't all. Merchandise, dishware, as well as the goalposts were painted with pink stripes. Xochitl was a cartoon little girl in pigtails and was selected as the imagery for the tournament, which some pointed to as attempting to undermine the on-field athleticism. However, to be fair, the 1970 World Cup in Mexico did feature a doughy, sombrero-sporting little boy as their mascot, so it may have just been an attempt to create a thread line between the two events. There's no questioning many viewed this not entirely as a soccer tournament. I found a New York Times piece from June 27, 1971, titled, "Soccer Goes Sexy South of the Border." Subheader, Women's World Cup aimed at the two passions of men. The first line reads, "The second Women's World Soccer Championship, August 15th to September 5th, promises to be something of a mixture between a sports event and a beauty contest." An organizer of the tournament, one Jamie DeHato, is quoted as saying, "We're really going to stress the feminine angle." The article goes further, claiming that women who play soccer are generally not muscular monstrosities, but rather actually very pretty girls. And because of this, the uniforms will be as close to hot pants as possible, which I didn't know what those were. I looked them up. Apparently, it just means really, 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 really short shorts. I found a claim in the article that I didn't see pop up in many other places, but it mentioned that all lockers will feature beauty salons and dressing rooms so women can present themselves for interviews and public ceremonies complete with false eyelashes and lipstick and an attractive hairdo. Looking back, all of this stuff sounds insane, yet this was press essentially promoting the tournament, quoting an organizer of it. The most fierce antagonism would come from none other than the Federation of Mexican Football, which was absolutely against the sanctioning of this tournament, and threatened any male professional clubs with fines should they allow any games to be played on their fields. This resulted in Estadio Azteca and Estadio Jalisco becoming the two main host stadiums, both privately owned and therefore did not have to comply with Federation policies. Ironically enough, they were also much, much larger than just about any other stadium throughout the entire nation. The tournament itself featured 6 teams: Mexico, Argentina, France, England, Italy, and defending champs, Denmark. Mexico kicked off the tournament with a 3-1 victory against Argentina, played in front of an estimated crowd of 100,000. If you'll remember, the 1999 Women's World Cup final, still nearly 30 years down the line, is frequently cited as the largest crowd in women's soccer history. If we are to believe the accuracy of this 1971 match, it dwarfs the 99 final by almost 10,000. Crazy enough, this wouldn't even be the largest crowd turnout in this very competition. With a 4-0 victory against England, Mexico easily advanced to the semifinals, earning them a rematch against Italy. This time, the Mexicans came out on top, flip-flopping the score from the previous year, winning 2-1. On the other side of the bracket, the Danes had a dominant path to another finals appearance, whomping Argentina with a 5-0 victory. It's hard to overstate the excitement that I've seen occur when a host nation has a chance to win a tournament. If Tampa Bay was in a whirlwind after the Bucs Super Bowl win, just imagine that feeling touching an entire nation. The men's English team had done it 5 years prior in the '66 World Cup, winning the tournament for the first and only time to date, with many Brits claiming the cup had come home. Of course, gender discrimination likely would deter many people's excitement, but when people are winning and wearing your nation's flag, there is a psychological attachment for many that is too hard to ignore. This was evident on the day of the final match, live and in person, as 110,000 fans packed into the stadium, more than any had for a single match in the Men's World Cup a year prior. It's quite an extraordinary sight to imagine, and it is something you largely have to imagine. There's little in footage of the final. However, I was able to stumble upon a few short clips, and the stadium is undeniably packed, not a gap in the crowd in sight. But everything I've read about is there, including the impossible to miss pink outfits and pink goalposts, which are in fact 100% present. While I couldn't tell you if it was the first of the match, the footage I found does show one goal by 15-year-old Danish player Suzanne Augustin. The footage isn't a high enough quality to identify her by face, but I know it's her because she showed up that day and shocked Mexico with a hat trick, earning the Danes back-to-back world titles with a 3-0 victory over the Mexicans. A tragedy for the Mexican players and the majority of the fans there that day. A victory on home soil, just so close. Meanwhile, upon returning home, Danish women were treated to a celebratory evening at Copenhagen Town Hall. However, due to the tournament not being sanctioned by FIFA, their championship was not recognized by the Danish Football Association. So, they were celebrated, but officially had made little impact according to the highest levels of organizers of soccer in their country. Back in Mexico, as amazing as a run that the team had made in the tournament, the aftermath was soured by controversy that had been brewing in the week before the final. Leading up to the game, reports came out that the team was unhappy at their lack of pay, expecting what today would be around 2 million pesos, which, split between an entire squad, is about a few thousand American dollars per player. Despite being told they would earn this salary, they were now being denied pay. Things got so contentious that the squad almost boycotted the final, eventually deciding otherwise. However, as punishment for requesting their due pay, they were barred from practicing on official fields leading up to the match. Whether this act changed the outcome of the final, we'll never know, but it's another frustrating stain on what was truly a positive event as a whole, in my opinion. In the end, supposedly each was paid roughly $1,000, thanks in part to help from singers like Carmen Salinas, Susana Alexander, Veronica Castro, and Cristina Rubiales. Well, I found some reports that Jamie Hero, a football promoter, supposedly also helped. The 1971 Women's World Cup is almost an event out of time. How could 110,000 people, the population of a small city, attend a final one year and then have no regards for them the next? The answer may be somewhat simple. As one Professor Gene Williams, an academic lead for the Hidden Histories of Women's Football project at the National Football Museum, puts it, Mexico 71 was a success because the organizers did not assume it would be a commercial or sporting failure. It was sold and promoted as a football tournament, one that just happened to feature women. Of course, the merchandise and branding featured direct attempts to advertise to women, but the tournament as a whole, well, that was simply about soccer. While my father wasn't born at the time of the Women's World Cup, he was just a few years later. When I asked him if he had ever heard of it, he shook his head no. Of course, he's from a small town that had little access to live TV back then, but it seemed the team's tournament run did not make it into the knowledge of the general public across the nation. He remembers being absolutely ecstatic when Mexico hosted the Cup in '86 when he was a kid, but nothing of the women from the decade before. And that's where we're going to leave it to end part 1. In part 2, we're going to explore the years following the '71 Cup and how the United States, despite a lack of deep ingrained soccer culture in the country, managed to have a meteoric rise in a short span of time and become the best women's soccer team in the world.